Welcome. In this session, I'm going to explain how a two-stroke carburetor works, and if you notice the carburetor itself, it's slightly different in shape to the average carburetor. Notably, of course, on this one we've got the primer bulb there, and I'm going to go through how that works. Now let's imagine we've got X-ray vision and we could see through the carb body. It would look something like this. Now let me simplify this drawing even more so it's more like a schematic diagram. There we go. The primer bulb system is linked in strongly with the rest of the workings of the whole carburetor. It's all integrated and they couldn't work separately. Let's just imagine now that this is a brand new carburetor and it's fitted to a brand new machine, and we've just put fuel in the fuel tank for the first time, so it's never had any fuel go through this carb at all. So really what we've got in there then is just air. So imagining this as being a brand new carburetor then, on a brand new machine, we'll be wanting to use the primer bulb for the very first time. And in order to see things a little clearer, we'll zoom in on this point here so we can see all those workings inside the carb. Okay, that's a little clearer. And of course the primer bulb here we'll now need to press. So let's imagine the end here of the primer bulb is pressed upward towards the carb. Now instantly we can see that the air wants to travel out of the primer bulb, and it wants to go through the centre there. Of course the air wants to go through the centre here because we're forcing it upwards through there. The full workings of this rubber valve will become more apparent shortly, but for now the air has forced its way through the centre of it and opened a little one-way valve there at the top. In comparison, if we take a look before we press the primer bulb, we can see there that that valve is shut, and we forced that valve open with air, as you can see now, when the primer bulb was actually pushed. Okay, now air is forced up through the centre and it goes up the fuel lines here, and it continues through and all the way across and down out through the return. This pipe here is the return pipe back to the fuel tank. So basically all we've done at the moment then is we've forced air out of the primer bulb through the fuel lines and out back towards the fuel tank. Now let's let go of the primer bulb and allow it to spring back to its original position. And as it does come back to its original position, a vacuum is created inside there. But air can't come back the way it just went out. It can't come back into the primer bulb. And that's because of this valve here that I mentioned. This one-way valve now, because of that vacuum, has closed shut. And of course air, as I've said, can't come back the way it's just gone out towards the tank in the return pipe. Now because air can't be drawn back this way, because that primer bulb can't suck the air back in basically there, it will need to draw some air in. Otherwise the bulb won't be able to expand, and that's where this rubber valve comes in. Now this rubber valve is a very special valve. As well as having a valve in the centre where I mentioned earlier, it's also got valve flaps here on the side, and it's this area where the air is drawn back into the primer bulb itself. And the way it does that is when suction is created by the primer bulb itself, it draws in air underneath the valve flap, and as it does so it lifts those valve flaps off their seat, allowing the air to enter the primer bulb. So that air is now coming into the primer bulb, allowing it to expand, but it's creating a vacuum behind it. Up in these fuel lines here, air is travelling down into the primer bulb, and of course that's creating a vacuum, and that vacuum is being felt up above here inside the metering area. And that's because air wants to leave this metering area here in order to go down into the primer bulb, and that of course is creating the vacuum inside of here. Now let's just take a quick look inside of here. This here shown in brown is the metering gasket, and below it here shown in green is the metering diaphragm, and it's these two that are vital at this point. And that's because the metering gasket creates a perfect seal, allowing that vital vacuum that we need, that will become apparent very soon, and it also compartmentalizes that vacuum in order for the metering system to work correctly, as we'll see shortly. And the metering diaphragm is used by that vacuum in order to operate the metering system, and let's take a look how. Well, as we can see by those blue arrows there, we've got air leaving the metering system, and that's building up that vacuum. It draws the metering diaphragm upwards towards the centre there, centre of the metering system. And that's because it's made of a special material that allows the centre of it there to move up and down accordingly, as and when there's vacuum up there. When the metering diaphragm is in its expanded state like this area of the metering diaphragm, which is a metal area like a little dowel area which is part of the diaphragm, contacts the back of the metering lever. This forces the back of the metering lever downwards. This allows the metering lever to pivot on its pivot point here and overcome the pressure of the metering spring, whose job it is to keep the metering lever upwards. That pivoting action lifts the front end of the metering lever, and connected to the metering lever is the metering needle. So the metering needle now moves with the metering lever, and it's moved that needle backwards off its airtight seal. The tip of the metering needle is generally made of like an hardened rubber, and when it contacts its seat in its normal position, it creates that airtight seal. But because we've overcome that metering spring and allowed the lever to tilt backwards and lift the front up, it's now opened that seal, and that vacuum pressure from below freely draws down the air from above here, down past that open seal and down alongside the metering needle inside this special tube that the metering needle operates through. So that's all being sucked down by the primer bulb, but at the same time the suction pressure lifts a little tiny valve flap that's part of the diaphragm here. This diaphragm is the fuel pump diaphragm, and the little valve flap that exists there is lifted up because of that suction pressure above. And if we take a closer look, we can see that that little valve flap does form part of the fuel pump diaphragm itself. It's also known as a reed valve. It's basically a one-way valve which is made of the same material as the diaphragm itself, and it lifts and closes just in that area. As I've said, it is a one-way valve, and its primary function is to allow flow this way only and not the other way, because if it started to go the opposite way, it would just close that valve flap and stop flow. So it goes through this way only. But at this point the primer bulb's still rising, so we've got suction pressure coming down this pipe here, and it's that suction pressure that's lifted this valve flap off its seat and allowed flow through, and of course it continues down then the regular path we've just mentioned. Going further now, that vacuum has felt right back here. It's all the same tube and it's felt right back to this point, and air is sucked out of this area here. This is the fuel pump reservoir, and the real function of this area will become apparent shortly. But for now, if we notice, we've got two pipes. We've got one that we've just seen coming in, and we've got this one here. And of course suction pressure is felt here as well. And of course air starts to come down here and fill the fuel pump reservoir behind it. So air is drawn down this tube here, and there's a special opening there that's open all the time. I know the gasket shows that it isn't, but there is a special opening there, and you can see by the little dotted lines that's what I've illustrated it as. So there's a hole there, and it travels down, the air travels down, and it leaves this area here, the upper area. And that of course creates a further vacuum in this upper area here. And it's this vacuum that lifts another little valve flap off its seat there, and the vacuum can be felt now underneath. This of course allows air to come underneath it. Again, this is a one-way valve, so it lets air this way, and it enters this upper cavity here on its way round the system. And now that valve flap's open and we've got vacuum. That vacuum can be felt all down this fuel line here, or fuel vein as we sometimes call it. And it's felt right back up here to another special opening, and this is again another opening that's open all of the time. I couldn't show it because of the gasket, but I've put some little dotted lines there to show that this is a constant hole. So it travels down there, and as it does so, it continues that vacuum pressure up here in this little chamber. We'll just zoom out again so we can see a little clearer, and that vacuum there is felt beneath here, because again there's a direct hole in the diaphragm allowing for this. And if we take a closer look there, we'll see that this here is what we call a strainer filter. This strains fuel as it comes into the carburetor, and they can be cleaned or they can be replaced. So from this area then, we've got a direct hole through the gasket and through the diaphragm, and then all of that vacuum can be felt all the way up this fuel tube, so it sucks upwards. And just to illustrate, of course, this is where the fuel pipe from the fuel tank is fitted. And with this fitted, a result of all that vacuum pressure means that we're going to draw some fuel up into this pipe from the fuel tank. And as long as the primer bulb itself is drawing back out and to its original shape and causing a vacuum, then fuel will be drawn up and there'll be a vacuum all inside these areas we've just shown. Because ultimately that air just wants to come down these pipes and end up inside the primer bulb itself, because it's the primer bulb that's sucking it in. It's worth noting at this stage that the vacuum pressure comes down the side channels here. So it doesn't come through the middle there, because through the middle is where we actually expel the air. It actually comes down the sides here on the outer part. So it comes back through into a different compartment. So everything's been drawn through as a result of the primer bulb opening, and now it's open to its full extent. We take a look inside now, everything is still. The wing areas on this special rubber valve have now returned to their seat, so there's nothing coming underneath them. It's just their normal natural springiness and their rubber that allow them to return to the seat. And of course that's the reason they've returned to the seat, because there's nothing pushing them open. To be specific, there isn't two rubber flaps here at all. This is just a cross-sectional view of one whole rubber valve flap, if you like. But if we notice at this point, there's nothing moving. Inside the carburetor here, in the fuel bulb and in all of these areas within the carb, there's air in there, but none of the air is moving in any direction. Now if we notice here, we've still got fuel in the fuel pipe, and it hasn't actually leaked back towards the tank. And the reason for that is, for this little valve flap here, we saw earlier what this valve flap does, and we saw air coming underneath it. But essentially what it's done is it's gone back onto its seat, and it's separated this compartment here in the upper area from the fuel line below. And that's because this fuel here, still in the fuel line, would ideally like to naturally fall back to the tank under atmospheric pressure. So as the weight of this naturally pulls back towards the tank, it creates a vacuum of its own in these pipes here, all along these fuel lines. And it's only a very small vacuum it creates, but it's enough to pull down on this valve flap here and put it fast on its seat to stop any flow going back through it. And that's great news, because we don't want to lose that fuel back to tank, because next time we press the primer bulb, we want to pull that fuel up further, and there's no way we could do so if we keep losing it back to the tank. As we know, there's also a valve flap there, and that's naturally at this point resting on its seat. So as it stands, both valve flaps are now in the down position on their seat. And that completes one push of the primer bulb, and now we're going to push it again. So let's press the bulb in again, and as you can see, we've got the air escaping through the center there. And that really is the only way the air can go, because it can't go past these flaps here, because when we press down and force that air upwards, the air acted on those flaps there. So it acted on that special valve and pushed it further on its seat. So there's no way it could go back up through these fuel lines and into the metering area. So it can only go out and back towards the fuel tank. So it's worth noting at this point that the only area of movement is the return system. The other areas of the carburetor are perfectly still. Okay, the bulb's been pressed in, of course, so let's now release and let the bulb expand back to its original state. And now we can see the changes occurring again inside the carb. And the one noticeable thing now is the change in flow. We've got air coming down into the primer bulb now, because the primer bulb's expanding and sucking down on that air. So it's creating the vacuum back along these pipes in the metering system, and it's all the way up here. It's felt all the way up to the top, and also of course it's felt here in the fuel pump reservoir, and it opens the valve flaps so that air can come underneath it, as we explained earlier. So now we've got this vacuum pressure felt here, and a result of having all this vacuum pressure here now is that it's drawn this fuel up a little bit further, and that's exactly what we need it to do. Okay, so as the bulb cycles right back, it draws that fuel up a little bit more, and of course that's the second time we press the bulb, and of course now we need to press it again. And just like before, the air pressure has pushed the rubber valve fast on its seat, stopping the air pressure from going up this way and into the metering area, and so it can only go one way again, and that's through the center, because we forced through that one-way valve, and out through the return system again. Everything else in the carburetor, as before, is still. Okay, at this point now we'll release the bulb yet again, and it will draw back just like it did before. The one-way valve in the center will close, stopping any air coming in through the return, and airflow will flow down and into the bulb as it did before, coming out of the metering area. And so when the bulb is fully open again, we can see that fuel has been drawn in even further. And again, fuel's kept in this line here, and it doesn't leak back towards tank. Remember, because this diaphragm here, the little flap on the diaphragm, is held fast on its seat, preventing it from flowing backward. And now we'll press the primer bulb yet again. And again, we've got the air forced out through the center there, through that center one-way valve, out and into the return. Okay, releasing the bulb again, and it's drawing back, and it's drawn fuel now into all these compartments and all these fuel lines, so it's drawing it further into the carburetor. And as always, by the time the bulb is drawn right back, it's brought that fuel in even further. As I've said before, none of this fuel can leak back because these two diaphragm flaps here are fast on their seat at this stage. Okay, pressing the bulb again, and that air again forced out into the return. And what we can see now is that fuel is starting to come into that needle valve area. So it's no longer air coming through, it's fuel, and it's traveling down alongside the needle valve within that channel that the needle valve operates up and down within. And it's being sucked that way because of the air that's leaving the metering area and going to the primer bulb. And remember, it's that air leaving the metering system that's drawing up on this diaphragm here, keeping the lever at the back pushed down, and of course pushed up at the front as a result, and opening the gap there, allowing the fuel in, which will then quickly be drawn this way in following the air leaving this area. Okay, so as the primer bulb continues to open out and draw back, we've got fuel now all inside this metering system here. And what I should have mentioned earlier is that this is the main jet, and fuel travels up this area into the venturi. And what there is just there at the tip of the arrow is there's a special valve that doesn't allow any leak upwards until the engine has started, until we've got a vacuum up above there from air rushing into the engine. So fuel doesn't actually go this way at the moment. And of course it was the same story when this area was filled with air. It couldn't go back up this way. Okay, so the primer bulb's fully extended back now, and we can see there it's brought in a lot more fuel, and it's brought it right down into this line here, which is almost at the primer bulb itself. But at the moment the primer bulb is still full of air, but if we press it once more, and then when we release, we can see now that it's starting to draw in that fuel. It's being drawn down the special inlet channels here, and it's coming down here under the special one-way rubber valve. It's lifting that off its seat and seeping through. And now what we have is, as long as that bulb is drawing back now and going back towards its original shape, it will be drawing up in all of these areas and keeping that vacuum, allowing fuel to come directly now from the fuel tank all the way through the carburetor and start to fill that bulb. And at this stage the bulb will be opening slower because now it's drawing in a liquid rather than air. And as we know, no air will be drawn into here to mix with this fuel, because we don't want that, because we've got the one-way valve in the middle there stopping any air coming back in from the return, and it's the suction pressure that's pushing that valve together even harder, so nothing will come through that way. So when the bulbs come right back, we can see we've got some fuel in there now, and we've maintained all the pressure above so nothing can leak back above, and now we can push the primer bulb again, and this time we're forcing out fuel. There is air being forced out in front of it, the rest of the air that was in the primer bulb, but the fuel now is going through the center valve there, the center one-way valve, and that's now heading towards the return. Okay, so we've released the primer bulb again now, and it's drawing in fuel here in the inlet, and fuel is coming in down this inlet channel here into the primer bulb. So now as the primer bulb expands and draws back, we're just seeing this steady flow now all the way through the carburetor and down into the bulb. A complete flow now of fuel all the way from the tank. So now when the primer bulb is fully extended back, we can see there that there's no air whatsoever in the primer bulb because we got rid of it all earlier. And all the way through the carburetor now, from the inlet from the fuel tank all the way through the center of the carb and down to the bulb, it's all just fuel. And now when we press the primer bulb, we're forcing out fuel It's just fuel now going out into the return, and that fuel has pushed out that last bit of air that was in the return, and now we've got fuel now going through to the return fuel tank area. So what we're doing now, when we push the primer bulb and release it, we're just having fuel cycling through from the inlet side of the fuel tank and out to the return. So we could say now that this carburetor is considered primed.